This is a fern, a plant that looks pretty ancient, and they are, as a group, they're some of the oldest plants on Earth. And some fossils actually date back to the Devonian period, which was around 360 million years ago. So, before the dinosaurs first appeared, which was roughly around 230 million years ago. Today there's over 10,000 species of ferns, and that makes them the second most diverse group of vascular plants in the world, and they're beaten only in diversity by flowering plants. So being a vascular plant, ferns, like many other plants, have specialised tissues, and these specialised tissues conduct water and nutrients, and they're otherwise known as the xylem and the phloem. Most ferns are herbaceous perennials, and that just means that they have soft, green and flexible stems above the ground, rather than any woody growth, and they live for more than 2 years. Now, the ferns that I often come across, such as the male fern or the lady fern, they are deciduous, and all that means is that the leaves, or the fronds as they're called, will die back in autumn, and then in the following spring they'll begin to emerge again from the rootstock. So when these plants emerge again from the rootstock, it's definitely my favourite part of the fern's life cycle, because when the fronds first emerge, they emerge all curled up, and in this stage the fronds are called fiddleheads, and you can see in the video these fiddleheads, but the process of unfurling can take days or sometimes weeks. Now, sometimes the fiddleheads of particular species are eaten, and in some places like Sarawak, Borneo, a particular species of jungle fern is a prized delicacy, and people absolutely love to eat this with a mixture of like chili and garlic and fish sauce and all sorts. But I'm definitely not suggesting you go out and look for some ferns to eat, because sometimes ferns are difficult to identify and a lot of them are really toxic. When it comes to reproduction, a lot of plants produce seed, and these plants are known as spermatophytes. But ferns are different to seed producing plants in that their method of reproduction is to produce spores. So this is kind of similar to mushrooms, but the spores of ferns are located in little cases called sporangium, and the sporangium can be found on the underside of the fronds. Now, if you go out and you end up having a look for these sporangium the next time you find a fern and you can't actually see them, this doesn't mean that they're not there, it's just that not every frond has sporangium, but the fronds that do have them are called fertile fronds. Or it could just be the case that you've stumbled upon a plant that's too immature to start reproducing and hasn't actually developed any sporangium yet. But when these sporangium are kind of arranged in clusters, they're called sori, and the arrangement of sori is really important in being able to identify particular species and when it comes to the classification of ferns. So when the spores are released from the sporangium, and the time of the year that this happens really depends upon the species, but many do it in mid to late summer. The spores are carried by air currents, and if they land in a hospitable environment, which in many cases is somewhere damp and shady, then a new plant will begin to develop, and this tiny plant is called a gametophyte. Now, this gametophyte has both a male reproductive part called the antheridium and a female reproductive part called the archegonium. And if conditions are suitably moist, then fertilization will occur between these two and a new fern plant is born. But reproduction doesn't actually have to be limited to the production of spores in ferns, so they can also reproduce vegetatively, and this is where a new plant will grow from a fragment or a cutting of the parent plant. Or sometimes it'll grow from a specialized reproductive structure called a vegetative propagule, and this is a form of asexual reproduction. So all that asexual reproduction means is that rather than the offspring, or the new plant in this case, having a combination of genetic information from both a male and female, it is essentially just a copy of the parent, a complete identical clone. So leaving the science behind and finishing up with some myth and folklore about ferns, they definitely have some kind of otherworldly look about them, something really mysterious, and maybe it's just because of how prehistoric they seem, but the fact that they don't produce seeds baffled people for centuries before modern science, and the only way that these people could kind of rationalize this was by coming up with different myths and legends. So one of these legends actually suggested that fern seeds are invisible, and that if anyone were ever able to catch an invisible fern seed, it would give the catcher the ability to turn invisible themselves. Ferns are also tied in with weather magic, and burning them was said to cause a storm, And traces of this belief can still be found to this day in the Devonshire moors, where it's customary to burn growing bracken to produce rain. In Celtic shamanism, uncurled fronds of male fern were gathered in midsummer. They were dried and carried for good luck. And many believe that ferns are powerful protective plants and that fairies are especially drawn to them. Some people believe that if you put ferns in a flower arrangement, they actually boost the magical properties of the plants that they share that arrangement with.